dear learners, and a very warm welcome to this course, Introduction to Indian Psychology. In this program, I hope to share with you some very valuable insights that this civilization has offered in helping human beings understand their own nature, understanding how they have to live with the world, so that the experience of life can be more meaningful for oneself and for everybody else. In the first lecture, which is going to be a course overview, I'm going to share with you the frameworks that I propose to use in order to present the course, and then a little bit about the course itself, and finally we will look at certain quotations and also the references. So this would be a typical format that I will follow, where I will talk to you a little bit about the introduction, introduce the new subject, then go into the quotation, food for thought, as well as introduce certain exercises, and then we close the session. So just imagine that there is a car that comes and stops in front of you, and you know nothing about that car. You don't know what is its make, you don't know what condition it is in, you don't know how fast it can go, you don't know how much fuel there is, you don't know where it is going, and you don't know who's driving it. How many of you will enter such a vehicle? Very few, if not none. And that is because entering into such a circumstance of the unknown is potentially dangerous. Now, what if I tell you that you find yourself in such a car? What will you do then? Very often people suggest maybe we'll try and get out, some say we'll pray, or the others who are a little more practical would say we'll try and connect with the driver. Now, I think that's the best case scenario. In a situation of lack of control and you can't get out very easily, it is better to identify the person who's in control, connect, and then try and negotiate a way with that person so that you can reach your destination safely. Take another case now. Imagine that you're just learning how to drive a car. Will you just go onto the main road? Again, no, because there will be an accident. What then? In such a situation, the reason we can, or the time in which we can step onto the main road is when we are confident that we know the rules of the car, we know the rules of driving ourselves, we are confident of our potential to drive, and we also know the rules of the road. And that's the scenario in which we can safely go onto the road. So the ancients across the world, not just in India, recognized very early on that all of us are already inside certain cars. On an individual level, we are all inside this vehicle that is carrying us through the journey of life. Do we know anything about it? Very little. We don't know how the heart beats, we don't know how often we breathe, we don't even know who the driver is very often. Is it us who's driving the car? Is it the body? Is it the mind? Is it the emotions? Is it the neighbors? Is it an influencer on social media? Who's driving our car is a question that we don't always have answers to. So, the ancient rishis as well as mystics around the world realized that in order to drive more safely, one has to start understanding the mechanisms and the workings of this car. And when they have that understanding, to next understand the laws that govern this universe, which would then ensure that the driving is safe for the individual as well as for the collective. Now, this process of thinking that we just underwent a little bit is something known as a first principle thinking, which means that when you're in a certain situation, try and identify or deconstruct the different components of that particular problem so that there is greater clarity around its subcomponents. When you have a better understanding of those smaller units of that larger problem, put it together and you have a much more holistic understanding of the problem at large. So here we have Elon Musk, who is a very successful entrepreneur, and this particular feature of the ability to think first principles is also a feature of many successful people. So what does he say? He says, first principles is a way of thinking that helps you break down a problem to its most fundamental truths and then reason up from there. I think this is one of the key features of psychology as a whole, and this is a framework that I'm going to be using in the course of this presentation. We also have Naval Ravikant, who talks about first principles thinking. He says it is about knowing the difference between what you are told and what is actually true. And this is very relevant in the case of our own nature, where we are forever creating an image of ourselves based on what other people are telling us. But is that really who we are? And that is a question that psychology is concerned with. And from ancient times, that is what has bothered psychology. The ancients recognized very early on that in order to understand or in order to decode the problem of human existence, it is very important for us to ask these first principle questions about the human being and human existence on the whole. Besides using the first principle thinking framework to study this subject or to present this course, I also propose to use two other frameworks from an Indic perspective that will help us understand and appreciate the different aspects or the different concepts that we're going to discuss in this particular formation. So here we are going to talk of one known as the Anubandha Chatushrayam, or which are the four requisites that are used in order to present any subject. So the first is Vishaya or topic. What is the topic that one is discussing? Second is Adhikari. Who is the audience who is receiving this particular presentation or this particular knowledge? Third is Prayojana. What is the need for discussing about this particular topic? And finally, what is the relationship or sambandha between all of them? The second kind of Indic framework that I propose to use is connected to the cases of the Sanskrit grammar, which in my opinion is a little bit like a systems thinking approach to any problem. So the first questions that we will ask is, who is presenting this? What are they presenting? How are they talking about it? Why are they talking about it in this particular manner? From where are they getting their ideas? What has been the backdrop for arriving at that particular idea? Whose ideas are we discussing and whose context are we talking about this? When and where was this idea proposed or these concepts framed? And again, we look at the sambandha or the relationship between all of these. So now let's apply this framework to the subject that we are going to study. The first Anubandha is topic. So what is the topic that we are discussing? In this context, it is psychology. So what is psychology dealing with? It is dealing with, many say the brain, the different aspects of the brain. Some say it's about the soul. So psychology allows us to encompass all these different domains of study. It also talks about being and becoming. Who are we? Who are we becoming in the process of life's experiences? Are we becoming a thinker? Are we becoming scientists who go into space? Or are we getting spaced out with everything? Or do we take the path and get into discovering the inner spaces of our existence? And therefore, what exactly is psychology? So if we look at the Dictionary of Psychology of the American Psychological Association, which is one of the most authoritative bodies on determining the psychological standards of modern psychology today, so they say that psychology is the study of mind and behavior. But in the course of time, this particular definition was refined and it became psychology is the scientific study of behavior and mental processes. What then is Indian psychology? This is a definition by Cornelissen, Mishra and Verma in the book Foundations and Applications of Indian Psychology that is really worth reading for anybody who is keen to understand more about the subject. So what they're saying is that by Indian psychology, we mean an approach to psychology that is based on ideas and practices that developed over thousands of years within the Indian subcontinent. So there is a geographical basis for this knowledge. Indian is used to indicate and honor the origin of this approach to psychology, the origin of the underlying philosophy, the conceptual framework, the methods of inquiry, the technology of consciousness that it uses to bring about psychological change and transformation. It may be useful to make explicit that we do not use the word Indian to localize or limit the scope of this approach to psychology, in the sense that this is not the psychology of the Indian people alone, and nor is it the psychology that is taught in Indian universities. Instead, they say that we hold that Indian psychology as a meta-theory, an extensive body of related theories and practices which has something essential and unique to contribute to the global civilization as a whole. Therefore, to summarize it, this particular definition is found in the website of the Indian Psychology Institute, another very authoritative website to find a lot of information pertaining to the subject. So there they're saying Indian psychology is an approach to psychology based on the Indian ethos, the characteristic spirit of the Indian civilization. One could also say that it is a psychology rooted in the consciousness-based Indian worldview, yoga and a life-affirming spirituality. The next question is Adhikari. Who should study Indian psychology? Is it meant only for psychology students and teachers? Or is it meant for anyone who's interested in self-development? The third point in the Anubandha Chatushtayam is prayojana, or the need. Why do we need to study Indian psychology? One of the reasons to do so could be a very nationalistic reason in the context of the NEP 2020, which is saying that when we are discussing about psychology, we need to include the contributions that Bharata or India has made in that particular knowledge domain. And in this context, we see that during the colonial period, Sri Aurobindo and other scholars like him who were also trying to promote nationalistic education had very important ideas to say in this context. So he says, we shall review European civilization entirely from the standpoint of Indian thought and knowledge, seek to throw off from us the dominating stamp of the Occident. What we have to take from the West, we shall take as Indians. And the Dharma once discovered, we shall strive our utmost not only to profess but to live in our individual actions, in our social life, in our political endeavors. So, as part of NEP 2020's efforts, where UGC has mandated that we need to include the contributions of the Indian civilization in the context of psychology as well, this is an important requirement. But is that all? We also find another reason to do so. So, psychology as it stands today, if you look at the timeline of psychology, we see that there is very little reference that is given about the contributions from different civilizations into the domain of psychology. The present modern psychology or the mainstream psychology tends to be predominantly Euro-American in terms of the theories that it has proposed, in terms of the experimentations that have happened, in terms of the frameworks that it uses, in terms of the research approaches that it has to understanding human nature. And psychologists across the world have recognized this lacunae and are talking about the fact that human beings belong to different cultures. And therefore, we cannot ignore the cultural component of the psychological study. And so, in today's context, there are a lot of new fields that are emerging, like indigenous psychology, cultural psychology, etc. It is also in this context that talking about Indian psychology becomes very relevant. There is a third reason why we need to study Indian psychology, and that is because this particular approach to psychology offers a very broad-based spectrum of consciousness as the basis of human nature. And if we look at human beings from that perspective, we discover very different ways in which to deal with problems, to identify ourselves, to deal with other individuals, to live our lives altogether. And modern approaches to psychology are often limited by their need to be objective and empirical in the way that they approach the study of human nature. In India, there has been a long-standing tradition, a very well-documented tradition of subjective methods of inquiry that have withstood the tests of time. And what is required today is to look at Indian psychology, to look at what are the different ways, what are the different techniques in which we can marry the contemporary methods with the ancient methods of subjective ways of self-inquiry and see what we can evolve in the context of Indian psychology here. Another reason for studying psychology and Indian psychology in particular is in the fact that life is a process of construction that is taking place. At every moment of our lives, we are in the process of constructing ourselves as well as constructing the realities around us. So it is very helpful to understand what is this construction all about. What are the foundations that we are laying? What are the bricks that we are choosing? If we make the foundations deep and strong, only then will the structure stand tall. If we use the best quality of bricks in a collective society, the bricks are the individuals. So if we put our focus on cultivating good quality bricks, then that particular society will be sturdy and resilient. We see that in the context of the Indian civilization, we have been an extremely resilient society who has withstood several shocks of circumstances across millennia. And this could only have happened if there was a very robust way of understanding human nature and the different implications that it has in the process of co-constructing the self with the others. And therefore, trying to summarize it, what is the purpose of why should we study Indian psychology today? to summarize, we see that life is a very stressful experience. There are several mental health challenges and issues coming up. People are grappling with issues of identity and meaning. In this context, Indian psychology has a lot to offer to anybody who cares to delve deeper into this domain. Secondly, mainstream psychologies, as we've seen, are predominantly material or mechanistic in their approach to understanding human nature. Indian psychology offers a much more holistic understanding of the human being, and therefore this becomes a study that is worth undertaking. To continue, I will just give you a flow of the entire course. So in the beginning, the first week, we'll start with psychology, its definitions and scope. We'll look at the evolution of the term psychology, etymology, history, approaches, and important questions. Moving on to the definitions of psychology, and we see how, as the term psychology or as the definitions of psychology evolved, the ways in which they were being researched and the scopes and challenges that they offered varied. Next, we'll move on to the select schools of Western psychology. We'll look at just a few because the focus of this course is primarily on Indian psychology, but it's helpful to understand the different models of the human being, or what I'm calling the psychophysiological anatomy or the PAN, which represents the models that every school of psychology is referring to. Because what we tend to do is we tend to assume that different schools of psychology are talking of the same model of the human being. The moment we recognize that actually they're not referring to the same model, then a lot of clarities emerge as to why the different schools are proposing the solutions that they do and the theories and the research methods that they're offering. Next, another important area is the relationship of brain, mind, consciousness. This is an evolving subject, and as technology progresses, there are newer and newer findings that are substantiating this relationship between these three components and bringing greater clarity about what really is the brain, what are its limitations, where does the mind interact with it, and what is their role with consciousness at large. Next, we will look at the weeks 3 and 4, and here we'll really start entering into the main topic of our study, which is Indian or yoga psychology, because there is a little bit of a challenge even around the term Indian psychology. So we're going to look at what are certain fundamental questions that were raised by Indian psychologists. What are certain schools like Vedanta, Sankhya, Ayurveda, what are their models of the human being that they are presenting, and what are the implications thereof? What are certain foundational concepts of Indian psychology? What's the concept of self, identity, their relationships? What is the spectrum or the map of consciousness? What are the different states of consciousness? What are the different ways in which we can know about them? And then we look at certain larger frameworks, civilizational frameworks like Satyam, Ritam, Brihat, and Dharma, which have served as the foundational pillars of the civilization. And in that context, we look at the idea of Prakriti, which is our nature, Swabhava, Swadharma. How do we understand the raison d'etre of our existence and what we are supposed to be doing here? In weeks 5 and 6, we will look at some more concepts of Indian psychology like Purusharthas. What are the larger context in which we are leading our lives? What are the different stages, the Chaturashrama? What are the values that we had to try and acquire? Daivi Sampat. What are those that we should resist? Asuri Sampat. And the consequences of having them or not having them. What is the theory of karma? What's the importance of Viveka Buddhi, which is the discretionary intelligence? And also we look at some of Vedic psychology, which is looking at life through a symbolic lens. And in that, two main ideas like Rina and Yajna. In the next week, we will look at the concepts of mind and mind plus plus in Indian psychology. So mind plus plus was a term that was coined by Professor Partha Pratim Chakraborty, a former director at IIT Kharagpur. So when we were having a discussion, he brought this term up and I thought it was a very interesting one to introduce. So we'll talk of the Vedic conceptions of the mind, the conception of mind in the 6 philosophical schools, and the conception of mind in Buddhism and Jainism. And then in weeks 7 and 8, we look at the mind, senses and body complex as presented in the Yoga Sutras, Bhagavad Gita. What is mind, its processes, the senses, their role, the 3 gunas of the Gita, the 3 qualities that define our lives. And we'll also look at how Patanjali talks about mastering these through the eightfold path of the Ashtanga Yoga. And then we will look at certain streams of yoga that in order to find the best relationship between mind, senses and being, how do we talk about the different definitions of yoga? what is cognition, emotion, and volition in Indian psychology, what are the different streams of yoga like Jnana Yoga, Bhakti Yoga, Karma Yoga, Raja Yoga, and also Tantra. And then when we talk of Tantra, we can't ignore the concept of the chakras, their influence in our lives. We'll also look at parallels with the modern systems of psychology. And in this, we'll talk of the techniques of consciousness, the Indriya, how do you have Indriya Jaya, or the training of senses and extrasensory perceptions, Vak Sanyama, or the importance of understanding the control of speech, Pranayama, the power of prana and its movements in our body, its potentials and its mastery, Dharana and Dhyana, the visualization, concentration, and the power of manifestation. As well as we look at the concepts of integral well-being like cultivating sukha. So I've given an etymological understanding of this term which matches with what the Upanishads have to describe it as. And here sukha is referred to as self-architecture. We'll look at achieving swasthya from an Ayurvedic perspective, but which also will have an etymological, the Sanskrit roots approach to understanding the concept. We look at Sthita Prajna from the Gita. What does it mean to be established in oneself? What does it mean to be a yogi or a yogini? This is a term that is used very loosely. But just because one practices yoga, does that make us a yogi or a yogini? Or what does it really entail? And then what is one of the important directions, movements of consciousness in the Indian psychology, which is going from Swarat to become master of oneself to the master of the world, Samrat. So in weeks 11 and 12, we will look at certain living examples of the best that Indian psychology had to offer in terms of the realizations that we can have if one practices the techniques that are proposed therein. So we have a few stories of Sadashiva Brahmendra Saraswati, Sri Ramakrishna Paramahansa and Swami Vivekananda, Sri Aurobindo and the mother from Pondicherry, Ramana Maharshi, also from the south, Tiruvannamalai, Mata Amritanandamai, Neem Karoli Baba, and also some modern spiritual masters, if we have the time to incorporate some of them. And then we look at certain applications of Indian psychology. So certain research methods, scopes and challenges, human development, the pedagogy, applications of it in pedagogy, therapy, exploring certain extraordinary human experiences, and we will wrap up with that. And to summarize it all, we see that there are certain features of mainstream or Western psychology and Indian psychology. Mainstream Western psychology tends to focus on behavior, mind, personality development. And Indian psychology tends to focus on consciousness-related matters, on self-realization as a goal. But it is very important to add that both these approaches, largely these approaches to psychology, are complementary and not contradictory, because we find that within Western psychology there are different schools of psychology that are inspired by Indian and Asian schools of thought, and they are moving towards more consciousness-based approaches to understanding human nature, like maybe transpersonal psychology, etc. And we see that Indian psychology also is borrowing methods from Western psychology wherever required in order to substantiate the different approaches that it has adopted to understand human nature. So therefore, it wouldn't be fair if we are trying to bracket them in silos. But we understand that while they are different approaches, they have also things in common and there are areas of overlap, and we also can appreciate what more each of them has to offer to complement the overall understanding of human nature. And therefore, looking ahead, what we propose to do is to go from Western foundations to Indian paradigms of mind and the self, and towards an applied and transformative psychology. And to leave you with some food for thought, Sri Aurobindo in the Synthesis of Yoga says, "The inner being is a vast universe in itself." There is also an associated idea that comes up often in this context. It says, "Sooner shall you reach the end of the universe than the depth of your own being." And we find this remarkable similarity between the brain cell and the universe. So there are some references here. Thank you and happy discoveries. Namaste.